The stars above Zelani Prime burned with an unnatural red glow. Ambassador Kethvara stood on the observation deck of the failing orbital station, watching her world die below. The beautiful blue oceans that had covered 60% of her planet were now dark pools of writhing organic mass. The silver cities where her people had lived for thousands of years were being consumed by creatures that defied every law of nature she knew. The Void Swarm had come 3 months ago. At first, the Zelani thought they were dealing with a simple invasion. Their military, though small, had always been enough to handle pirates or the occasional border dispute with aggressive neighbors. But these creatures were different. They did not want territory or resources in any way the Zelani understood. They wanted everything. Every living being, every plant, every microbe. They consumed it all and turned it into more of themselves. Kethvara's hands shook as she activated the communication array one more time. She had sent dozens of messages across known space begging for help from anyone who would listen. The responses had been predictable. The Altarian Republic sent their sympathies and promised to remember the Zelani fondly after they were gone. The Centauri Trade Federation offered to buy any valuable artifacts before the planet fell completely. The mighty Draconian Empire, with their powerful fleet and warrior culture, had reviewed the tactical data and declared the situation hopeless. The message she was about to send would be her last. The station's power grid was failing, and the swarm's biomechanical tendrils were already reaching into the lower levels. Soon, even this final sanctuary would be consumed. She opened the channel to broadcast on all known frequencies, hoping against hope that someone somewhere would care enough to try. Her voice was steady despite the tears flowing down her face. The Zelani had always prided themselves on their dignity, even in the face of extinction. She spoke clearly into the transmitter, knowing that her words would travel across the galaxy long after her world had fallen silent. The message was simple. Her people were dying. Their children were being taken and converted into nightmare creatures that served the swarm. Their beautiful world was being stripped bare and reformed into a breeding ground for horrors beyond imagination. They had perhaps days before the last of their population centers fell. Anyone who received this transmission and had the power to help was begged to do so. The Zelani would not forget such kindness, if any of them survived to remember it. As she finished the transmission, explosions shook the station. Through the viewport, she could see swarm bioships rising from the planet's surface, their organic hulls pulsing with alien life. They had found her location. She had minutes, maybe less. Halfway across the galaxy, Captain Jake Morrison was having a boring day. The human patrol ship New Horizon was conducting routine surveillance along the edge of human space, monitoring for any signs of pirate activity or unauthorized border crossings. It was the kind of assignment that looked important on paper, but usually involved long hours of staring at empty space while automated systems scanned for threats that never materialized. Morrison was reviewing supply reports when his communications officer, Lieutenant Pete Collins, called out from his station. The young officer had been with the crew for only 6 months, fresh from the academy and still eager to prove himself. Morrison liked that about him. Too many officers lost that enthusiasm after a few years of patrol duty. Collins reported that they were receiving a distress signal on the diplomatic emergency frequency. The transmission was weak and breaking up, but it was clearly a plea for help. Morrison ordered him to clean up the signal and put it through the ship's translation matrix. Most alien languages required computer assistance for humans to understand, and even then, nuances were often lost. What came through the speakers made Morrison sit up straight in his command chair. The voice was clearly female, though the species was unknown to him. The desperation in her tone needed no translation. She was describing the systematic destruction of her entire civilization by something called the Void Swarm. The tactical data included in the transmission painted a picture of complete military collapse and impending extinction. Morrison had seen war before. He had fought in the Martian colonial rebellion, and later in the asteroid belt conflicts against smugglers and pirates. He knew what desperation sounded like, and this alien's voice carried the weight of watching everything she loved being destroyed. The clinical reports included with her plea made it clear that her people had perhaps days before complete extinction. He immediately ordered Collins to forward the entire transmission to Earth Command with a priority flag. The message would reach Admiral Lisa Carter's desk within hours, thanks to the quantum communication network that connected all human military installations. Morrison had served under Carter during the Belt conflicts and knew she was not the kind of officer who would ignore a cry for help, regardless of species or politics. The response from Earth Command came faster than Morrison had expected. Admiral Carter herself appeared on his secure communication screen, her expression serious. She had reviewed the transmission and the attached tactical data. The situation was indeed as desperate as the alien ambassador had described. The Void Swarm appeared to be a hive-minded species that converted organic matter into soldiers for their expansion across space. Carter told Morrison that humanity would respond to the plea for aid. This decision would likely cause political complications with other galactic powers who preferred to avoid costly military interventions, but Carter had never been one to let politics override moral duty. The Third Fleet was already being assembled under Commodore Ryan Mitchell's command, and they would depart for Zalani space within 72 hours. Morrison was ordered to proceed immediately to the coordinates provided in the distress signal. His ship would serve as advance reconnaissance and attempt to establish direct contact with any surviving Zalani forces. The captain acknowledged his orders and set course for what the galaxy had written off as a lost cause. As the New Horizon jumped to faster-than-light travel, Morrison reflected on what they were getting into. The galaxy knew humans as Deathworlders, a term that was not exactly complimentary. Earth was considered a nightmare planet where everything was trying to kill everything else. The dominant species had evolved from persistence hunters who chased their prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. Other civilizations whispered about human military tactics with a mixture of fascination and horror. The truth was, most galactic species had evolved on worlds that were far more hospitable than Earth. Their wars were often ritualistic affairs with minimal casualties and clear rules of engagement. They built their societies around avoiding conflict and maintaining stability. Humans, on the other hand, had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting for survival against their own planet, their environment, and each other. This difference in perspective made humans uniquely suited for situations that other species found hopeless. Where the Draconian Empire saw tactical impossibility, humans saw a challenge that required creative solutions. Where the Altarian Republic saw inevitable defeat, humans saw people who needed help and were willing to fight for them. The journey to Zalani space would take several days even at maximum speed. Morrison used the time to study everything known about the Void Swarm and prepare his crew for what they might find. The reports were not encouraging. The creatures seemed to be perfectly adapted for overwhelming conventional defenses through sheer numbers and biological resilience. Most military analysts considered them unstoppable once they established a foothold on a world. But Morrison had learned long ago that unstoppable was often a matter of perspective. Every enemy had weaknesses, every strategy had counters, and every seemingly hopeless situation had solutions if you were willing to think outside conventional wisdom. The Zalani had asked for help, and humanity had never been good at ignoring those who needed them. The New Horizon continued its journey through space, carrying with it the promise that the Deathworlders were coming, and they intended to even the odds. Admiral Lisa Carter stood in the command center at Earth Command headquarters, watching the largest military mobilization in human history unfold before her eyes. Through the massive viewing windows, she could see the Third Fleet assembling in Earth's orbital space. 12 heavy cruisers moved into formation alongside 30 destroyers, their dark hulls bristling with weapon systems that made other species uncomfortable. The flagship of the fleet was the Defiance, a massive battlecruiser that embodied everything other civilizations feared about human military design. Where alien warships were built for elegance and efficiency, human vessels were constructed like their creators had learned to survive on Earth. They were tough, adaptable, and capable of continuing to fight even after taking damage that would cripple ships from more civilized worlds. Commodore Ryan Mitchell had arrived from the Mars orbital yards just 6 hours after receiving his orders. Carter had chosen him to command the fleet because of his experience in the asteroid belt wars, where combat took place in environments that would kill most species just by existing there. Mitchell was the kind of officer who understood that sometimes the only way to save lives was to be willing to take them. The Commodore stood beside Carter, reviewing the tactical displays that showed the deployment of his forces. His weathered face showed no emotion as he studied the reports from Zilani space. 3 worlds had already gone completely silent, their populations either dead or converted into something worse. The remaining 4 planets were under siege, with millions of refugees crowded into failing defensive positions. Mitchell had fought against pirates, smugglers, and colonial rebels throughout his career. He had seen the aftermath of raids on civilian settlements and knew what desperate people looked like when they had nowhere left to run. The Zilani distress signal had reminded him of messages he had received from mining colonies under attack, except this time an entire species was facing extinction. The fleet's ground forces were assembling on Luna Base, where Colonel Amy Rodriguez was preparing the 47th Marine Expeditionary Unit for immediate deployment. Rodriguez had earned her reputation during the Martian colonial conflicts, where she had led her Marines through underground tunnel systems filled with hostile fighters who knew the terrain better than any human had a right to. The colonel walked through the staging areas where 3,000 of humanity's finest soldiers were preparing their equipment. These were not ceremonial guards or peacekeeping forces. They were warriors who had trained their entire careers for exactly this kind of mission. They practiced fighting in environments that would be lethal to most galactic species, using tactics that other civilizations considered war crimes. Sergeant Tony Martinez was checking his squad's gear when Rodriguez stopped to speak with him. Martinez had served under her command for 5 years and had never seen her look more serious. She explained that they would be deploying directly onto hostile planets where the enemy outnumbered them by millions to 1. The Void Swarm had turned entire worlds into breeding grounds for creatures that existed only to consume and convert organic life. Martinez nodded and continued his preparations. His squad had trained for urban combat on worlds where the atmosphere could kill them, and the wildlife considered humans to be food. Fighting alien creatures on a dying planet was just another day at the office. The sergeant had grown up in the slums of New Detroit, where survival required constant awareness of threats from every direction. The Void Swarm might be more exotic than the gangs he had fought as a teenager, but the basic principle remained the same. Dr. Helen Walsh was in her laboratory aboard the research vessel Discovery, studying every piece of data available about the Void Swarm. As the fleet's leading xenobiologist, she had been tasked with finding weaknesses in an enemy that had overwhelmed every military force it had encountered. The preliminary analysis was disturbing. The creatures appeared to be a perfect fusion of organic life and mechanical technology, capable of rapid adaptation and reproduction. What worried Walsh most was the swarm's apparent intelligence. This was not a mindless plague spreading across space. The tactical data from Zilani space showed coordinated attacks, strategic thinking, and the ability to learn from each encounter. The creatures had studied their prey and developed countermeasures for every defensive strategy the Zilani had attempted. But Walsh had spent her career studying life forms that thrived in conditions no sane creature should survive. Earth's deep ocean trenches, the radiation-soaked moons of Jupiter, the chemical hellscapes of Venus's upper atmosphere. Life found ways to exist in places that seemed impossible, and if it could survive, it could be killed. Everything had weaknesses if you knew where to look. The galactic community's reaction to humanity's mobilization was swift and predictable. The Altarian Republic sent a diplomatic note expressing concern about human military intervention in what they considered an internal matter. The Centauri Trade Federation worried about the economic implications of armed conflict in a region they had planned to strip mine after the Zilani were extinct. The Draconian Empire's response was more complex. For decades, they had been considered the premier military power in known space. Their warriors were fierce, their technology was advanced, and their strategic thinking was respected across the galaxy. But they had reviewed the same tactical data and concluded that the Void Swarm was unstoppable. Now they watched with nervous interest as the humans prepared to attempt what the Draconians had declared impossible. Ambassador Kevin Hart was fielding complaints from a dozen different species about humanity's unilateral decision to intervene in the crisis. The Galactic Council had not authorized military action, and several member species were concerned about the precedent this would set. What would stop humans from intervening in other conflicts without permission? Hart's response was diplomatic but firm. Humanity had not asked for permission because they did not need it. The Zilani had sent a distress call that any civilized species should feel obligated to answer. If the Galactic Council was unwilling to act, then individual species retained the right to respond according to their own moral standards. The truth was that most galactic civilizations were terrified of humans precisely because of situations like this. Other species calculated cost-benefit ratios before committing to military action. Humans seemed to make decisions based on whether something was right or wrong, regardless of the political or economic consequences. This made them unpredictable and dangerous to established power structures. Captain Jake Morrison received regular updates from Earth Command as his ship approached the edge of Zilani space. The closer they got to their destination, the more disturbing the sensor readings became. Entire star systems showed signs of massive ecological disruption. Planets that should have been teeming with life registered as barren wastelands covered in organic structures that defied classification. Morrison had served in combat zones throughout human space, but he had never seen destruction on this scale. The Void Swarm was not just conquering territory or enslaving populations. They were systematically converting entire worlds into extensions of their hive mind, turning every living thing into a component of their expanding consciousness. The New Horizon received a weak transmission from the remaining Zilani forces as they entered the outer system. High Counselor Veth Kalar's voice was barely recognizable through the static, but her message was clear. The defense of their homeworld was collapsing. They had perhaps hours before the last of their strongholds fell to the swarm. Morrison acknowledged the transmission and pushed his engines to maximum speed. Behind him, the Third Fleet was still days away, but he could begin reconnaissance and possibly provide some assistance to the survivors. The captain had no illusions about what his single ship could accomplish against an enemy that had overwhelmed an entire civilization, but sometimes holding the line for a few extra hours could make all the difference. As the New Horizon approached Zilani Prime, Morrison could see the extent of the devastation. The planet's surface was covered in a web of organic structures that pulsed with alien life. Massive biomechanical ships moved through the atmosphere, like living things, harvesting the last pockets of resistance with methodical precision. The captain opened a channel to Earth Command and reported what he was seeing. Admiral Carter's response was immediate and decisive. The Third Fleet would accelerate to maximum speed and arrive in 36 hours. Morrison was ordered to locate the surviving Zilani forces and provide whatever assistance possible until the cavalry arrived. Morrison smiled grimly as he acknowledged his orders. The galaxy had written off the Zilani as a lost cause, but humanity had never been good at accepting the impossible. The Deathworlders were coming, and they intended to even the odds. The edge of Zilani space was a graveyard of worlds. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the New Horizon, watching his sensor displays paint a picture of systematic destruction that defied belief. 3 entire planets showed no signs of life whatsoever. Their surfaces had been stripped bare and covered with massive organic structures that pulsed with alien purpose. The beautiful blue world that had been Zilani Prime according to their star charts was now a writhing mass of biomechanical horror. Morrison ordered his ship to full stealth mode as they approached the system. The New Horizon had been designed for reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, and her advanced sensor suite could gather intelligence while remaining virtually invisible to most detection systems. What those sensors revealed made even the veteran captain pause in shock. The Void Swarm had transformed the conquered worlds into something between a factory and a living organism. Massive tentacle-like structures reached up from the planet's surfaces into space, connecting to bioships that moved with the fluid grace of sea creatures. The entire system had become one enormous hive, with each component serving the collective consciousness that drove the swarm's endless expansion. Lieutenant Pete Collins was monitoring communications from his station when he picked up a weak transmission from the 4th planet in the system. The signal was heavily encrypted and barely strong enough to reach them, but the translation matrix identified it as coming from surviving Zilani forces. Morrison ordered Collins to boost their receivers and clean up the signal as much as possible. High Counselor Veth Kalar's voice came through the speakers, distorted by interference but unmistakably desperate. She was broadcasting from the last remaining defense station on Zilani 4, where approximately 2 million refugees had gathered behind failing energy shields. The swarm had been attacking the position for 18 hours straight, wearing down their defenses through sheer persistence. Rather than tactical brilliance, Morrison established contact with the Zilani survivors and introduced himself as the advanced scout for a human relief force. The silence that followed his transmission lasted so long that he wondered if the communication link had failed. When Veth Kalar finally responded, her voice carried a mixture of hope and disbelief that no translation software could fully convey. The Zilani had heard stories about humans, whispered tales that painted them as creatures from a nightmare world where everything tried to kill everything else. Most galactic species considered Earth to be barely habitable, a death world where only the most aggressive and adaptable life forms could survive. The idea that beings from such a place would travel across space to help strangers was almost impossible for civilized minds to accept. Morrison provided Veth Kalar with a tactical assessment of the situation and promised that human reinforcements were only hours away. The Third Fleet under Commodore Mitchell's command was pushing their engines beyond safe limits to reach Zilani space before the last stronghold fell. In the meantime, the New Horizon would do everything possible to assist the defenders. The captain ordered his weapons officer to begin targeting the swarm bioships that were concentrating their attacks on the refugee camp. The New Horizon carried armaments that most galactic civilizations considered excessive for a reconnaissance vessel. But humans had learned long ago that being outgunned was often fatal in their line of work. Their first missile strike caught the swarm completely by surprise. The bioship that had been leading the assault on the defense station simply ceased to exist, vaporized by a fusion warhead that released more energy in 1 second than most species used in a year. The other swarm vessels immediately began scanning for the source of the attack. But human stealth technology was generations ahead of anything they had encountered. Morrison ordered a hit-and-run attack pattern that would keep the swarm forces confused while minimizing the risk to his ship. The New Horizon would strike from one position, destroy a target, then relocate before the enemy could respond. It was a tactic that required precise timing and nerves of steel. But Morrison's crew had trained for exactly this kind of mission. From the surface of Zilani 4, the survivors watched in amazement as their tormentors began falling from the sky. Swarm bioships that had seemed unstoppable were being destroyed by an enemy they could not see or understand. For the first time in months, the constant pressure of the attack began to ease as the creatures tried to adapt to this new threat. Dr. Helen Walsh was monitoring the engagement from her laboratory aboard the approaching fleet flagship Defiance, and the sensor data being transmitted by the New Horizon was providing invaluable intelligence about swarm tactical behavior and biological structure. What she was learning contradicted many of her initial assumptions about these creatures. The Void Swarm was not simply a mindless plague spreading across space. The bioships showed signs of individual intelligence and adaptability, suggesting that the hive mind was more complex than anyone had realized. Each creature was capable of independent thought and decision-making while still serving the collective consciousness that coordinated their expansion. This discovery had serious implications for the coming battle. Human military doctrine was based on the assumption that they would be fighting predictable enemies who followed established patterns. The swarm appeared to be learning from each encounter, adapting their tactics in real time to counter new threats. This made them far more dangerous than the initial reports had suggested. Commodore Ryan Mitchell received Walsh's analysis as his fleet prepared to drop out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Zilani space. The tactical situation was more complex than they had anticipated, but Mitchell had fought adaptive enemies before. During the asteroid belt conflicts, he had faced pirates who changed their strategies after every engagement, forcing human forces to constantly innovate new approaches. The Third Fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, 12 heavy cruisers and 30 destroyers arrayed in a battle line that stretched across thousands of kilometers. The sight of so many human warships in one place was unprecedented in galactic history. Most species maintained small, specialized fleets designed for specific missions. Humans built their ships for war and deployed them in numbers that reflected their planet's violent history. The swarm's response was immediate and overwhelming. Bioships began emerging from the converted planets in numbers that defied counting, moving toward the human fleet with the coordinated precision of a single organism. The creatures had learned from their encounters with other galactic militaries and were prepared to deploy everything they had against these new invaders. Mitchell ordered his ships to assume defensive positions around Zilani. While ground forces prepared for immediate deployment, Colonel Amy Rodriguez's Marines were already loading into drop pods designed to penetrate even the heaviest planetary defenses. The colonel had studied the tactical data from Morrison's reconnaissance mission and was adapting her assault plans to account for the swarm's biological nature. The first major engagement began when swarm bioships attempted to overwhelm the human destroyers through sheer numbers. What they encountered instead was a level of firepower that no galactic civilization had ever deployed in a single battle. Human weapons were designed not just to destroy targets, but to utterly eliminate them as threats. The space around Zilani 4 became a graveyard of organic debris, as wave after wave of swarm attackers were vaporized by fusion missiles and particle beam weapons. High Counselor Veth Kalar watched the battle from her command center on the planet's surface, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The human ships moved with a precision and aggression that defied everything she knew about space combat. They advanced directly into enemy fire, absorbed damage that should have crippled them, and continued fighting with a persistence that seemed almost inhuman. The swarm began adapting their tactics, attempting to use their superior numbers to surround and overwhelm individual human vessels. What they discovered instead was that human ships were designed to function as part of a coordinated fleet, with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support systems that turned their formation into a single, deadly organism. Captain Steve Parker commanded the destroyer Ghostwalker, leading a squadron in a running battle through the debris field that had once been Zilani's orbital infrastructure. His ship had taken hits that would have destroyed most alien vessels, but human engineering standards required multiple redundant systems and armor designed to keep fighting until the last crew member was dead. The tide of battle began to shift as the swarm realized they were facing an enemy unlike anything they had encountered before. These humans fought with a combination of technological superiority and tactical flexibility that made them incredibly dangerous. More importantly, they seemed willing to take casualties in order to achieve their objectives, a mindset that most civilized species found incomprehensible. As the battle raged in space, Colonel Rodriguez's Marines prepared for the most dangerous mission of their careers. They would be deploying directly onto the surface of a world that had been converted into a living nightmare, with orders to establish a beachhead and begin the process of driving the swarm back into space. The drop pods fell through Zilani 4's atmosphere like burning meteors, carrying 3,000 human Marines toward the surface of a world that had become a living nightmare. Colonel Amy Rodriguez rode in the lead pod, watching her tactical display as her forces scattered across the landing zone in a pattern that seemed random but had been carefully calculated for maximum effectiveness. Each pod was an armored capsule designed to survive impacts that would kill most living things. Other galactic species considered drop pod deployment to be suicidal, preferring to land their forces in safe zones far from enemy positions. Humans had learned long ago that safety was often an illusion, and that striking directly at the heart of enemy territory could achieve results that careful planning never could. Rodriguez's pod slammed into the surface with enough force to create a small crater. The impact systems absorbed most of the shock, but she still felt her teeth rattle as the pod's armor plating buckled and reformed. Emergency bolts fired, blowing away the pod's outer shell and revealing the hellscape that Zilani 4 had become. The planet's surface was covered in organic structures that defied description. What had once been cities were now sprawling masses of biomechanical tissue that pulsed with alien life. Massive tendrils stretched between buildings like veins, carrying nutrients and information throughout the swarm's living infrastructure. The air itself seemed thick with microscopic organisms that made Rodriguez's skin crawl despite her sealed environmental suit. Sergeant Tony Martinez emerged from his pod 50 meters away, already scanning for threats with the practiced efficiency of a soldier who had learned to survive in hostile environments. His squad formed up around him within seconds, their weapons ready and their movements coordinated through years of training in conditions that would paralyze most civilized beings. The swarm's response to the human landing was swift and overwhelming. Creatures that had once been Zilani civilians came pouring out of the organic structures, their bodies twisted and enhanced with biomechanical implants that turned them into living weapons. Behind them came pure swarm constructs, spider-like beings the size of ground vehicles that moved with predatory grace across the transformed landscape. Martinez opened fire with his plasma rifle, the superheated bolts tearing through swarm creatures with devastating effect. His squad advanced in a coordinated pattern that maximized their firepower, while minimizing their exposure to enemy attacks. They moved like pack hunters, using tactics that seemed to defy military logic, but had been proven effective through generations of warfare on Earth. Rodriguez coordinated the overall assault from her command position, watching as her Marines established beachheads throughout the landing zone. The plan was audacious even by human standards. Instead of trying to secure a safe perimeter and advance slowly, they were striking simultaneously at multiple swarm nerve centers, hoping to disrupt the creatures' coordination and create chaos in their ranks. Major Chris Thompson led a specialized engineering team toward what their sensors indicated was a primary swarm processing center. The structure was a massive organic dome that pulsed with bioelectrical activity, clearly serving as some kind of command node for the creature's hive mind. Thompson's mission was to plant a quantum virus designed specifically to disrupt biomechanical neural networks. The approach to the processing center was like walking through a living digestive system. The ground beneath their feet was soft and yielding, covered in a membrane that seemed to react to their presence. Organic conduits overhead carried streams of data and nutrients between different parts of the swarm's infrastructure. The entire complex was designed to be as alien and disturbing as possible. Thompson's team moved through the maze of organic corridors with mechanical precision. They had trained for urban combat in environments ranging from the tunnels beneath Mars to the floating cities of Europa. Fighting their way through a living building was just another day at the office for soldiers who had learned to adapt to any situation. The swarm creatures they encountered were unlike anything in human military databases. Some were clearly converted Zilani, their original forms twisted beyond recognition by biomechanical enhancements. Others appeared to be pure swarm constructs, grown specifically for combat roles. All of them shared the same relentless aggression and apparent inability to feel fear or pain. But humans had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them. They understood predators because they were predators themselves. The Marines advanced through the swarm-infested areas with the calm efficiency of apex hunters who had never learned to be prey. They used controlled explosions to collapse tunnel networks, set fires that spread through organic infrastructure, and engaged in close-quarters combat that would traumatize most civilized species. Captain Jenny Adams commanded the destroyer, Relentless, in the orbital battle that raged above the planet's surface. Her ship had taken multiple hits from swarm biovessels, but human engineering standards required ships that could continue fighting even after sustaining catastrophic damage. The Relentless was living up to her name, maintaining her position in the battle line despite hull breaches and failing systems. The space battle had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic warfare. The swarm bioships fought with organic weapons that grew and adapted during combat, while human vessels responded with technological firepower that could vaporize entire enemy formations. Neither side was willing to retreat, creating a grinding battle of attrition that tested both species' commitment to their respective causes. Adams watched her tactical display as wave after wave of swarm attackers threw themselves against the human fleet. The creatures were learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics to counter human strategies. But humans had been fighting adaptive enemies for their entire evolutionary history. Every improvement the swarm made was met with a counter-improvement from the human forces. On the planet's surface, Rodriguez received reports from her unit commanders that painted a picture of gradual but steady progress. The Marines had secured their initial objectives and were beginning to push deeper into swarm territory. The creatures' coordination was breaking down as human forces disrupted their communication networks and destroyed key infrastructure nodes. The Zilani survivors watched the battle from their fortified positions with a mixture of amazement and horror. They had never seen warfare conducted with such casual brutality. Human soldiers advanced directly into enemy fire, used explosives that would be considered war crimes by most civilizations, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat that seemed to violate every principle of civilized behavior. But the tactics were working. For the first time since the swarm had arrived in their system, the creatures were retreating. The relentless pressure that had ground down every Zilani defense was finally being met by something even more persistent and aggressive. The humans fought like the planet killers they were rumored to be, but they were killing the right planet. Dr. Helen Walsh monitored the battle from her laboratory aboard the fleet flagship, analyzing the massive amounts of data being transmitted by the combat units. Her preliminary findings were disturbing but also encouraging. The Void Swarm was indeed more adaptable than any enemy humanity had previously encountered, but they were also showing signs of something no hive mind should possess: uncertainty. The creatures were beginning to hesitate before engaging human forces, calculating odds and retreat options in ways that suggested individual self-preservation instincts. This was unprecedented for a species that had always fought with the absolute certainty of collective consciousness. The humans were not just winning tactically, they were causing fundamental changes in swarm behavior patterns. Thompson's engineering team reached the core of the processing center after fighting their way through layers of organic defenders. The quantum virus they carried was humanity's latest innovation in electronic warfare, designed specifically to target the kind of biomechanical neural networks the swarm used for coordination. Setting it off would require them to get within meters of the central processing unit. The core chamber was a cathedral of alien biology, with massive neural clusters suspended in organic fluid that pulsed with the rhythm of a living heart. Data streams flowed between the clusters like rivers of light, carrying information throughout the swarm's collective consciousness. It was beautiful in its own horrifying way, but Thompson's team had not come to admire alien architecture. They placed their charges with military precision, setting timers that would give them just enough time to reach minimum safe distance. The quantum virus would not just destroy this facility, it would propagate through the swarm's network, disrupting their coordination across the entire system. It was the kind of weapon that could turn the tide of a battle, if they could get away before it detonated. The explosion, when it came, was visible from orbit. A pulse of energy raced outward from the processing center, following the organic conduits that connected it to the rest of the swarm infrastructure. Across the planet's surface, creatures that had moved with perfect coordination suddenly began stumbling and falling as their connection to the hive mind was severed. The silence that fell over Zilani 4 was more disturbing than the sounds of battle had been. Colonel Amy Rodriguez stood in what had once been the capital city's central plaza, watching her Marines secure the area where millions of swarm creatures had simply stopped moving. The quantum virus had worked better than anyone had dared hope, severing the hive mind's control over its individual components and leaving them as confused, disconnected organisms. Rodriguez activated her communication system and reported to Commodore Mitchell that the planet's surface was secure. The remaining swarm creatures were either dead or wandering aimlessly without the collective intelligence that had made them so dangerous. Human casualties had been surprisingly light, considering they had just fought the most devastating enemy the galaxy had ever seen. High Counselor Veth Kalar emerged from the underground shelter where she had spent the last 3 months watching her civilization die. The Zilani leader moved slowly through the ruins of her world, unable to believe that the nightmare was finally over. The organic structures that had covered her planet were already beginning to decay without the swarm's constant maintenance, revealing glimpses of the cities that had once stood there. The reunion between the Zilani survivors and their rescuers was awkward in ways that no diplomatic training could have prepared anyone for. The refugees had lived in terror for months, watching their friends and family members being converted into monsters. Now they found themselves face to face with beings from a world so violent that most galactic species considered it barely habitable. But the humans who had saved them showed none of the savage brutality that their reputation suggested. Sergeant Tony Martinez helped elderly Zilani civilians out of the shelters with gentle hands that had been killing swarm creatures just hours before. Marine medics worked alongside Zilani doctors to treat the wounded, sharing medical supplies without being asked and showing compassion that seemed at odds with their fearsome military efficiency. Admiral Lisa Carter arrived aboard the command carrier Constitution to oversee the transition from combat operations to humanitarian relief. The Admiral walked through the refugee camps that her forces had secured, speaking with survivors and coordinating the massive logistics effort required to begin rebuilding an entire civilization. The scope of the destruction was overwhelming. 3 entire worlds had been stripped bare and would require decades of terraforming to become habitable again. The surviving population of the Zilani Confederation had been reduced to less than 5% of their original numbers. By any reasonable measure, the swarm had succeeded in destroying their civilization, but the Zilani were alive, and where there was life, there was hope. Human engineers were already working with their Zilani counterparts to design new cities that would rise from the ruins of the old ones. Medical teams were treating the psychological trauma that came from watching an entire species nearly go extinct. Most importantly, human diplomats were helping to establish communication with other galactic powers who might provide additional assistance. Dr. Helen Walsh published her analysis of the Void Swarm 2 weeks after the battle ended. Her report sent shockwaves through the galactic scientific community that were almost as profound as the military victory itself. The swarm had not been a natural evolution of organic life. They had been created as a weapon by some unknown intelligence and set loose to consume everything in their path. More disturbing was Walsh's discovery that the swarm's expansion had not been random. They had been fleeing from something in the galactic core, something that had driven them to desperate expansion across inhabited space. Humanity's intervention had not just saved the Zilani. It had bought the entire galaxy time to prepare for whatever had originally created and then hunted the swarm. The galactic community's reaction to this revelation was swift and predictable. The Altarian Republic quietly began upgrading their defensive systems and reached out to human military advisors for consultation. The Centauri Trade Federation started negotiating exclusive contracts for human-manufactured weapons, advertising them as Deathworlder military surplus to wealthy clients. The Draconian Empire's response was more complex. For generations, they had been the galaxy's premier military power, respected and feared by lesser species. The humans had accomplished in days what the Draconians had declared impossible, using tactics that seemed to violate every principle of civilized warfare. The Empire's military academies began quietly studying human combat doctrines, trying to understand how such apparently fragile beings could be so devastatingly effective. Captain Jake Morrison was promoted to Commodore for his role in detecting the original distress signal and providing crucial reconnaissance during the early stages of the crisis. His ship, the New Horizon, became the flagship of the newly formed Joint Human-Zilani Defense Force, a partnership between former predators and prey that should not have worked, but somehow did. Morrison found himself working closely with Veth Kalar to establish early warning systems throughout Zilani space. The counselor had initially been intimidated by the human officer, but she had learned to see past his species' fearsome reputation to the compassionate individual beneath. The partnership became a model for human-alien cooperation that other species studied with great interest. Commodore Ryan Mitchell received the Galactic Medal of Honor, the first human ever to be so recognized by the interstellar community. The ceremony was held on Zilani 4, in the rebuilt capital city that had risen from the ruins of the swarm's devastation. Mitchell's acceptance speech was brief and to the point, emphasizing that humans had simply done what any decent species should do when faced with genocide. The real changes, however, were happening in the shadows of galactic politics. Species that had previously dismissed humanity as primitive Deathworlders were now quietly updating their diplomatic protocols. The entry for humans in most galactic databases was moved from minor species to a new classification that roughly translated as Extinction Level Response. Authorized. Ambassador Kevin Hart found himself fielding requests for military cooperation agreements from powers that had previously ignored human diplomatic overtures. The same species that had complained about humanity's unilateral intervention in the Zilani crisis were now asking for defense treaties and technological exchanges. The galaxy had learned that some threats were better faced with human allies than human enemies. Colonel Rodriguez established a permanent marine base on Zilani 4, with the dual mission of protecting the rebuilding civilization and training local defense forces. The Zilani had been peaceful herbivores for their entire evolutionary history, but they were learning that sometimes violence was necessary to protect what mattered most. Human instructors taught them tactics that seemed alien to their nature, but might save their lives if the galaxy's new threat ever arrived. Dr. Walsh continued her research into the swarm's origins, working with scientists from across known space to piece together the mystery of what had created such perfect killing machines. Her preliminary findings suggested that the swarm had been designed as a cleanup protocol, created to eliminate civilizations that posed some kind of threat to their makers. The implications were terrifying for every spacefaring species. The most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed itself. For centuries, the various species had assumed that their greatest threats would come from each other. Wars were fought over resources, territory, and political influence. The Void Swarm had demonstrated that external threats existed that could destroy entire civilizations, without regard for politics or diplomacy. A year after the battle, Vethkalar stood in the memorial garden that had been built to honor the Zelani, who had died during the swarm invasion. The garden was located on the site where the final refugee camp had made its last stand, where human Marines had first landed to begin the liberation of her world. Flowers native to both Zelani 4 and Earth grew together in patterns that would have been impossible before the two species learned to work together. Morrison joined her for the memorial service, along with many of the human soldiers who had fought in the liberation. The ceremony was conducted in both languages, honoring the dead while celebrating the living. Children from both species played together in the garden's paths, representing a future that neither could have imagined before the crisis brought them together. The plea for aid that Kethvara had sent into the darkness of space had been answered by the most unlikely saviors imaginable. The Deathworlders had come not as conquerors or exploiters, but as protectors who asked nothing in return except the satisfaction of doing what was right. The galaxy would never be the same, and perhaps that was exactly what it needed to survive the challenges that lay ahead in the vast darkness between the stars.